Lovely.
So, ladies and gentlemen, it's Erev Pesach, and I was thinking to do something today slightly different to what we usually do, analyzing texts and learning directly Divrei Torah from the Chumash and Sefer Bereshis. I want to speak to you about a halachic drama, which had lots of both halachic and historical implications, and something which still is alive and well ad hayom hazeh, and affects Pesach and the way Pesach is run and enjoyed by Klal Yisrael. This story begins about 150 years ago. We are sadly today witnessing a war going on in Ukraine. Lahavdil, there was a halachic battle which developed into something of a war between rabbis about 150 years ago in the Ukraine. Two of the main centers of Jewish life in the Ukraine 150 years ago. One of them was a town called Brody, and the other was a town called Lvov, sometimes called Lviv or Lemberg. Between Lvov and Lemberg, I don't know exactly the geography, it's not more than 100 miles apart. But this battle erupted in a very, very interesting way. And here's the issue, ladies and gentlemen, you're going out to buy matzahs. Everybody now is going out to buy matzahs. Let me ask you a question. Round ones or square ones? That's my question. Are you going to buy round ones or square ones? Machine matzahs or hand matzahs? Right? What is the issue? How did this come about? Why is there a proliferation of both hand matzahs and machine matzahs? And is there any significant difference? Is anything interesting here? And the answer is, let me tell you from the beginning, that both hand matzahs and machine matzahs today are equally good and usable and valid and wonderful. And it's a matter of preference, really. It's a preference of taste, a preference of price, right? The hand matzahs are considerably more expensive than the machine matzahs. In fact, one person a couple of years ago who I met at a purchasing hand matzah shop said to me, I've got a new pshat why the Torah calls the matzahs lechem oni. He says, because after you've bought these matzahs, you're an oni. After you bought these matzahs, you're impoverished. That was his... Somebody just mentioned to me that Lvov was Poland. The truth is, places like Lvov and Brody changed hands regularly. And you're absolutely right. Sometimes it was Poland, often it was Ukraine. At the time that this was taking place, it was actually called Galicia. The whole area wasn't called Poland, and it wasn't called Ukraine, and it wasn't called Russia. The Jews referred to this whole area as Galicia, a country which, as far as I know, doesn't appear on the map anymore at all today. So the changing borders can be a bit confusing, that's true. But geographically, these places are located in what we call today Ukraine. But this was an explosion took place in the Ukraine 150 years ago, halachically and Jewishly speaking, which had ripple effects throughout the entire Jewish world. And it goes like this. From Moshe Rabbeinu until about 1840, all of Klal Yisrael ate round hand matzahs. Okay, so that's quite a long time, right? That's thousands of years. Every member of Klal Yisrael ate matzahs that were baked by hand and were round, and everybody knew what matzahs looked like, what they tasted like, how they were produced, and that was the norm. And then we're dealing with, in the mid-19th century, we're dealing with the Industrial Revolution. Part of the Industrial Revolution was that people were inventing machines to do everything, right? To making cloth and weaving and printing and trains instead of horse-drawn carriages. Life was changing radically because of the Industrial Revolution in so many ways. We haven't got electricity yet, but we've got machines. Some bright spark invented a machine for making matzahs. But guess what? These matzahs that were produced were not round. Horror of horrors, these matzahs were square. Okay, and as a result of which, the community got very confused. Very confused. What is the status of these matzahs, and how is it? How are we supposed to relate to them? What happened was that these matzahs started being used in Germany and in France and in England and even in America. These machines were imported, and eventually a massive American company, Manischewitz, started making matzahs. I was told that last year they made 100 million matzahs, Manischewitz. I'm not sure exactly what the numbers were. I'm not sure who's counting them, but certainly the production of machine matzahs is massive. And here in Yerushalayim, the Cohen Halperin factory also makes millions of matzahs. What is the issue here? And here comes a very fascinating story. That when the machine matzahs came out, there was a very serious rabbinic pushback against these matzahs. And this pushback was led by someone called Rabbi Shlomo Kluger. Rabbi Shlomo Kluger, who was the posek in Brody and one of the world-recognized Gaonim and the leader of the Hasidische community in Brody, the Galicia Hasidische community in Brody, and his word was sacred. And he put out, together with a few other Rabbanim, a pamphlet called Modo'ah LiYisrael, written in 1857. Modo'ah LiYisrael was a pamphlet in which he speaks about the terrible new innovation that has hit the Jews of Europe, the machine matzahs, and spelling out what was actually wrong with them. So I want to touch on one or two things about what was wrong with these matzahs from his point of view. First of all, these machines were difficult to clean. You'd have to, every 18 minutes, you have to stop the production and clean the machine. The machine has got lots of moving parts and wheels and machinery and conveyor belts of one sort or another. And don't forget, we're dealing in a world which hasn't yet got like stainless steel and plastic and detergents. And for example, nowadays, the matzah machines are, many of them, the way matzah machines work is that after one batch of baking, they use very powerful compressed air cleaning devices, which blast the whole machinery and get rid of every single crumb and every single piece of flour, and everything is cleaned out. And today, generally speaking, I think it's worth knowing, that nowadays, just generally in terms of making Pesach, we have facilities today which make Pesach cleaning so much easier. All our surfaces are smooth. They're not cracked. They don't have crevices in them. They are made of plastics, and we have things like tinfoil and plastic bags and detergents, all the things they didn't have even 150 years ago. None of that existed. So we're dealing with people who are washing things with water. And of course, if the problem is flour and you're washing it with water and you're dealing with chametz, that's not a very good idea to wash the flour with water, because what the problem is, it's going to be making chametz. Reb Shlomo Kluger was devastated. He was aghast that anybody could imagine that these matzahs, that these machine matzahs were acceptable. In addition to which, he cited all sorts of economic issues, side issues like the making of hand matzahs provided employment. For lots of people, lots of unemployed people in town got their employment from making hand matzahs, and the machine matzahs would put them all out of business. Apart from which, it was difficult to supervise exactly what happened to the leftovers and the scraps, and he had a whole list of problems which he accused the machine matzahs of being in violation of. What happened was that this Modo'ah LiYisrael objection of Shlomo Kluger snowballed, and he got on board the leaders of the major Hasidic communities of Poland and Galicia at the time. One of them was Rabbi Meir, the Chidushei Horim, who was the Gera Rebbe, a very influential Rav in the mid-19th century, the Gerer Rebbe also signed this total blast against machine matzahs and totally invalidated the machine matzahs, the Gerer Rebbe, and also the Divrei Chaim, who was the Sanzer Rebbe and the ancestor of other different Hasidic dynasties like the Kloisenberg and others. And he also wrote devastatingly against the machine matzahs. Hayitachem, that we should use machines, and who can control these machines and who can monitor these machines. And we know how to make matzahs, and we've been doing it since Moshe Rabbeinu for 3,000 years. We've been making hand matzahs. Why in heaven's name should we now use a machine? These were all, if you like, side issues. Let me now tell you what is the core halachic issue that came about regarding machine matzahs. And this is, let me give you a brief introduction. We all know that you go to a shop to buy matzahs, there are regular matzahs, and then there are shemura matzahs. What is the difference between regular matzahs and shemura matzahs? So some people think, a bit naively, the difference is that regular matzahs are, of course, kosher Pesach, but shemura matzahs are somehow super kosher Pesach. In other words, they are extra, or they're like mahadrin. The buying shemura matzahs is like buying mahadrin matzahs. Now, whereas that is true only in a very slight degree, in the sense that the shemura matzahs has a hashgacha mishas katsira, that it's supervised from the moment it's harvested, that the wheat doesn't come into contact with water, whereas the regular matzahs are only mishas tachina, from the time that they're ground into flour, which is a distinction, but not really an important distinction. The really important distinction between regular matzahs and shemura matzahs. Does anybody know what is the really important distinction between regular matzahs and shemura matzahs for 5 points?
Lishma.
What do you say?
Lishma.
Lishma. Thank you, Phil. Thank you very much. You've been doing your homework. Absolutely right. That machine, the question, there's a very interesting halacha in Orach Chaim Siman Tov Samach. In Siman Tov Samach, there's a requirement that shemura matzahs, in the manufacture of shemura matzahs, the person making them, when he's making them, has to say l'shem mitzvahs matzah. And if you go into a hand-making matzah factory, you will see all the people kneading and rolling and baking and muttering all the time to themselves, l'shem mitzvahs matzah, l'shem mitzvahs matzah, to make a kavanah. They're not allowed to talk about anything else while they're working. They've got to have their mind on lishma. What is that? So here's the interesting thing. We have generally, throughout the year, lots of mitzvahs which involve a type of cheftza shel mitzvah. Cheftza shel mitzvah, an object that's used for the mitzvah. Let's say a sukkah. You make a sukkah, you use it for a mitzvah. You blow a shofar, you use it for a mitzvah. Right? There are lots of things we use, objects we use for a mitzvah. But, for example, there is no requirement that a sukkah is manufactured lishma, or that a shofar is manufactured lishma. The sukkah has to have certain halachic, fulfill certain conditions, and it's a valid sukkah, and a shofar, and even a lulav and esrog don't have to be cut off the tree, l'shem mitzvahs arba minim. They are objects which are, if they conform to the halachic requirements, then it's a kosher esrog and a kosher lulav and a kosher sukkah. But there are some objects where Chazal learned from the Torah that there's an additional requirement that the cheftza shel mitzvah itself should be manufactured lishma, should be manufactured l'shem mitzvah, in order for what? Not in order to make it kosher Pesach. This has got nothing to do with hilchas chometz u'matzah. It's not to make it kosher Pesach. It's in order that you're able to fulfill the mitzvah of Asher Kedishanu b'mitzosu v'tzivanu al achilas matzah. In other words, the whole shemura matzah definition is only for eating the kazayas matzah on Leil Seder. It's not about the matzahs you eat on the next morning or for the whole 7 or 8 days of Pesach. It's not about that at all. It's about ba'erev tochlu matzahs. Chazal understood that there were actually two different mitzvahs when it comes to matzah. One mitzvah is Shibas Yomi Matzos Tochelu, that for 7 days you mustn't eat bread and you have to eat something, so you have to eat matzahs. But when you're eating matzahs on the second day of Chol HaMoed, that's not a mitzvah's assay of al achilas matzah. You don't make a bracha on the eating of the matzah. There you're eating matzah because Pesach, you have to eat and it's time to eat matzahs. But in actual fact, the only time you have a real mitzvah for eating matzah is on Leil Seder. I just want to mention in parenthesis that there is something of a debate about whether the main mitzvah is the first kazayis or the last kazayis. Many people make a mistake about the afikomen, and they think that really the first kazayis of matzah is the real mitzvah, and the afikomen is a little nibble that you have at the end of the meal before benching, you just to be yotze. This is a complete mistake. There are many Rishonim, including the Rambam and Rashi, who take the view that the real mitzvah of achilas matzah on Seder night is what we call the afikomen. That's the real mitzvah. And that's the time, so much so that the Rambam writes explicitly, actually, in Hilchos Chometz Matzah, the Rambam writes explicitly, if there's a shortage of Shmura Matzah, you're living in a town and there's very little Shmura Matzah around, and comes Leil Seder, and you've only got, says the Rambam, one kazayis of Shmura Matzah. When should you eat it? So the Rambam says you should eat it for afikomen. You should eat it as the last kazayis, because that is the real mitzvah. Dino, you want to say something?
Yeah, then why don't we make the bracha al achilat matzah for the afikomen? Why do we make it the first kazayit?
You're absolutely right. That is a question debated among the Rishonim. Some of them suggest that we actually should make it at the end, but the consensus is that since you're eating matzah earlier, it doesn't make sense to be eating matzah through the meal and then suddenly make a bracha ala achilas matzah. So they make the bracha in the beginning. But actually the kavanah should be that the real achila is there. Tosfos in Psachim, Dina, if you want a little bit of Talmudic footnote here, Tosfos in Psachim compares this to the way we fulfill the mitzvah of Tekiyas Shofar. So Tosfos says, look at Tekiyas Shofar, for example. In Tekiyas Shofar, he says the real mitzvah of Tekiyas Shofar is to blow the shofar in Musaf, to connect it to Malchus, Zichronos, and Shofars. What we do is we blow the Tekiyas, what we call the Miyushav Tekiyas, the Tekiyas before Shemona Esra, we blow it already then. And then we make the bracha. We make the bracha Lishmoya Kol Shofar on the first set of Tekiyas Shofar, but actually the real mitzvah is only later on. So Tosfos says that's similar to matzah, that we make the bracha al achilas matzah on the first kazayis, but the real mitzvah is only the last kazayis. Anyhow, the halacha is that we eat a first kazayis and a last kazayis, but it is important, ladies and gentlemen, to bear in mind that the last kazayis of matzah you eat is a very significant mitzvah and should be taken seriously. And both the first and the last kazayis represent the kiyum ha-mitzvah, the fulfillment of the mitzvah of al achilas matzah. Having said that, bearing in mind the topic about our shir today, what we need to have is shmura matzahs for the first and the last kazayis. In the middle of the meal, you can eat matzahs that are not shmura matzahs. Now, it is not the case that for the whole of Seder night you need shmura matzahs. You only need shmura matzahs for that moment when you're fulfilling the mitzvah, the first and the last kazayis. That's it. Probably also for kairach, for kairech, that we say kairech, also then you should use shmura matzahs, but actually the real chiyuv is the first and the last kazayis. Okay. What's the issue here? So the issue that Shlomo Kluger was very excited about, can anybody guess what his issue was here with the machine matzahs?
Machine can't make it lishma.
That's right. Can a machine fulfill the requirement that the matzah is baked lishma? Think about this for a second. When you're making the hand matzahs, there's somebody kneading the dough and saying l'shem mitzvah matzah, somebody rolling the dough l'shem mitzvah matzah, somebody putting it in the oven saying l'shem mitzvah matzah all the time, right? What happens in a machine matzah factory? There is one guy who is the mashkiach, right? Who's the rob who's responsible, gets to work in the morning, asks everybody ready, and says, right, l'shem mitzvah matzah, presses the button, and that's it. The water connects with the flour, and the machine kneads it, and the machine rolls it, and the machine flattens it, and it goes on a conveyor belt into the oven and out at the other end on another conveyor belt. Is that matzahs lishma? Asks Reb Shlomo Kluger. And he says, absolutely not. That's not lishma. That's machines. Machines cannot invest the matzahs with lishma. That was his claim. And that, I must tell you, ladies and gentlemen, for some people remains a little bit of a question. And indeed, there are some people who will indeed eat only hand matzahs, only for the first and the last kazayas, and for the rest of Pesach and the rest of the Seder night, they'll eat machine matzahs, only for this one reason, right? That maybe there is a question about the lishma. This was Reb Shlomo Kluger, backed up by the Chidushei Horim of Ger and the Divrei Chaim of Tzanz, and this became the position of the majority of the Hasidic communities in Europe. That is, Rabbi Say, half the story, and that happened in Brody. However, in Lvov, there was another Gadol, another great Pesach, whose name was Rav Yosef Shaul Natanzon, who was known in Klal Yisrael as the Shoyel Umeshiv. He wrote a whole series of responsa of Shalos and Tshuvos called the Shoyel Umeshiv, and the Shoyel Umeshiv has some very interesting. So, in the same year that Rav Shlomo Kluger published his pamphlet called Moda'ah L'Oraisa, a Moda'ah means what's a good translation for it? It's information. I'm giving information, giving a warning to Klal Yisrael. So Rav Shaul Natanzon published another pamphlet called Bitul Moda'ah. I am annulling this warning. This warning is annulled. That's Bitul Moda'ah. And he explained that actually, first of all, interestingly, his criticism of Shlomo Kluger partly is that Shlomo Kluger has simply been misinformed. He's been and this is actually a very interesting subject on which I can speak for hours. The question of Gedolei HaPoskim occasionally making a statement on issues about which they only know about second-hand or third-hand or fourth-hand. They've been informed by their advisors, who they have been informed by their advisors. In actual fact, critical details are simply wrong. And Rabbi Yosef Shaul Natanzon says that what Rav Kluger was speaking about was not a machine. That he's saying in Lvov, he's got a machine, and he's seen the machine, and he's seen a machine in Frankfurt, and he's seen a machine in Pressburg, and he's seen a machine in other towns in Krakow. They all had machine-baked matzahs, and he's seen the machines, and he inspected the machines, and not only they're kosher l'mahadrin, says the Shoel Umeshiv. Not only are they kosher l'mahadrin, but he says there are lots of advantages to a machine-made matzah, and he quotes several notices that have been put out in the past few decades before he wrote this by various different botei din, warning the people making the hand matzahs that they're not doing it properly. See that? Let me ask you a question. Who, imagine in a little shtetl in Galicia, you've got to make a few thousand hand matzahs, and you need someone to knead and to roll and to bake and everything. Who's going to do this job?
Teenagers.
What do you say?
Teenagers.
Yes, kids do it. This is the sort of work which, unfortunately, we generally refer to as it's not a job for a Jewish boy. In other words, it's anything which looks a bit like manual labor is not really considered by many people to be an option for them. We're suffering from this in Israel today enormously, this cultural issue of not a job for a Jewish boy, in that we employ Arabs throughout every city in Jerusalem. If we stop employing Arabs, we have to shut down our hotels and our hospitals and our building sites and our roadworks. We have to shut it all down because all manual labor is carried out by Arabs, because no Jewish boy wants to be involved in the manual labor involved in a hotel or a hospital or a building site or anything. So because we don't want to do manual labor, we have other people doing it for us. And in a few of these factories, they had actually employed non-Jews to roll the matzahs. And of course, a non-Jew can't make matzahs lishma, right? The Shulchan Aruch says explicitly the lishma has to be done by a Jewish person. So Rabbi Yosef Shaul Natzon says, look, the hand-making matzahs issue is very complicated, and it's subject to human error. And the people doing it get exhausted, they don't do it properly. Some of them are eating their lunch, their sandwiches while they're doing it because they can't take a break. He brings a whole list of evidences of people that hand-baked matzahs is actually more problematic halachically than the machine-made matzahs. And he gave a very categorical ruling. A machine-baked matzahs are not only as good as, but they're better than the handmade matzahs. And guess what? He also went around to senior poskim in Europe at the time, and he got several very choshev rabbanim to agree with him. One of them was Rav Ettlinger. Rav Ettlinger was known as the Aruch L'Ner. The Aruch Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, who was in fact the Rebbe of Shamshon Fall Hirsch. Rav Shamshon Fall Hirsch, when he speaks about his Rebbe said this or his Rebbe did that, he means Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, who was the Rov of Hamburg Altona. And he also had a machine in his town in Hamburg, and he inspected it very carefully. And he took the view that the machine-made matzahs are much better and much easier to monitor and easier to give a hashkacha to, and not subject to all the errors that hand-made matzahs. And so he preferred, Rav Ettlinger preferred machine-baked matzahs, as did Rav Yosef Shaul Natanson. And interestingly, I find this interesting, he also got the Ksav Sofer. The Ksav Sofer was the son of the Chasam Sofer, who was the Rov of Presburg. Now, Presburg, the Rov of Presburg and the Chasam Sofer, they weren't Hasidim. People make a mistake about the Chasam Sofer and his followers. They got very upset. They got a bit grumpy if you called them Hasidim. They weren't Hasidim at all. They were Hungarian Oberlanders, and they were Nusach Ashkenaz, right? But they were very Haredi, the most Haredi and Machmir type of Ashkenaz Yidden. And he came, the Ksav Sofer came and had a look at the machine, and he said, it's fabulous. He said, it's fabulous. And as a result of which, you had then two opposing halachic camps, on the question of, you're all going shopping, machine matzahs, hand matzahs. These were two different. What happened was, I think a bit sadly, eventually it sort of worked itself out along the Hasidim Misnagdim divide line, such that because the Ger Rebbe and the Divrei Chaim had spoken so strongly out against it, it became almost an article of faith in certain Hasidic communities that Chas v'Shalom, we don't use machine matzahs. Machine matzahs are drek, right? In some of the writings of some of the following generation of Hasidic Rebbes, they spoke about machine matzahs being so awful, they used the worst word possible. What's the worst word you can say about machine matzahs to tell people not to use them?
Apikoros.
Apikoros. Or in this particular case, yes, thank you, Phil. He said they're chometz. Just imagine saying they're chometz, right? When asked why are they chometz, he said, I'm not giving you any reasons why they're chometz. They're just chametz, right? Now you have here a very, very interesting, this whole saga is a very, very interesting example of events that unfolded in the 19th century. And let me explain you a little bit what is, in a sense, the backstory to this whole debate. On the surface, it was about questions of lishma, questions, principal questions about whether a machine could do the lishma. Just by the way, on that particular issue, one of them wrote the following point. They says, look, part of the new technology is printing, right? And everybody prints their sfarim. So printing is the new wonderful, when printing came out in the 1600s and was widespread, that was the new, if you like, the new internet of that century. That was an amazing new innovation, right? So in the context of machine matzos, one of the Rabbanim wrote, he says, look, if you're going to tell me that a machine can do kavana lishma, let's print our tefillin and mezuzahs. Let's print our tefillin and mezuzahs, and the sefer will press the button, and the machine will print tefillin and mezuzahs, and we'll get the printing font to be exactly the right font for the osius of the Torah, and we'll print it, and we could, if a machine can do lishma, why do we need handwritten Sifrei Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzahs by Sofrim? Is because we're machmir on the issue of lishma, right? If lishma can work through a machine, which at first sight is actually an interesting point. Everybody knows that you can't print Sefer Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzahs because you need the lishma. However, the truth is, on a deeper level, the poskim who permitted machine matzahs explain that there's the concept of lishma in matzahs and in Sifrei Torah, Tefillin, and Mezuzahs are two completely different concepts in halach, right? In the writing of the Tefillin and Mezuzahs, it has to be done l'shem, because of the Shem Hashem. The Shem Hashem requires a level of kedusha which obviously a machine can't do. Here, it only needs to be produced on a very basic level. The production has to be done l'shem mitzvah, and that can be done by somebody who presses the button and says l'shem mitzvah. I'm not going to go into all the halachic ins and outs and the sources and the texts and everything on this, but that was basically some of the issue. But what you have here is two sides. On the one hand, you have Rosh Shlomo Kluger, the Divrei Chaim, and the Chidushei Arim saying it's completely osa and it's terrible. And then you have, on the other hand, you have Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger, the Orach Lanea, and you have the Sholem Meshiv, Matanzon, and you have, there was also another very important Rav who came in on the side of the Sholem Meshiv, was someone called Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz. Now, Yisrael Lifshitz is famous to us for his commentary on the Mishnah called the Tiferes Yisrael. Most classic versions of Mishnah have a commentary called the Tiferes Yisrael, written by Rabbi Yisrael Lifshitz, who was the Rav of Danzig. Danzig was another important Jewish center in the mid-19th century, and he had a machine for matzahs, and he inspected it, and he thought it was terrific. According to one report, I'm not sure if it's true, when he saw it, he said, you can make on this a bracha to Hashem, Mechadesh Chodoshim. Mechadesh Chodoshim means who invents new innovations, because this is an innovation which will help Klal Yisrael. Part of the argument, incidentally, of the matirim, of the people who permitted it, was, don't tell me that hand matzahs are preferable for economic reasons because you're employing all sorts of kids making your matzahs. I'm going to produce matzahs at 1/3 of the price of your hand matzahs. I can produce matzahs which are so cheap that every family in Klal Yisrael can afford my matzahs. They can't afford your matzahs, but yet they can afford my matzahs, right? So the price of machine matzahs became also a very important issue, especially in communities where large parts of the community lived in poverty and they had no money at all for Pesach, and they lived off special handouts. But if you had machine matzahs, which would cost pennies, everybody could afford a machine matzahs, and they were made as shmura matzahs and in the best way possible. What is the backstory behind all this? The backstory is as follows, that in the 19th century, the real big battle wasn't these matzahs or those matzahs. The real big battle was the battle against Reform Judaism, against assimilation, and against what was often, I think wrongly, referred to as the Haskalah. The Haskalah simply meant people who engaged in higher education, who went to college, who knew the psychology and the philosophy and the law of the non-Jewish world, right? The truth is the opposition wasn't really to Haskalah as such, but Haskalah, people who went to the colleges and read the non-Jewish books, it was often a slippery slope into assimilation and sadly even into many hundreds of thousands of Jews in Western Europe particularly converted to Christianity in order to get jobs. You couldn't get a job in a university or in a clinic or practice as a lawyer unless you were a Christian. And you had to convert in order to get a job in any government-controlled office, right? Benjamin Disraeli had to convert to Christianity in order to become a member of parliament in England, because you couldn't be a member of parliament unless you were a Christian. So many of them converted to Christianity just for professional progress, for professional positions. And in general, there was this tremendous fight against the modernization of Judaism. And the Reform claimed that we are the modern Jews. We have modernized Judaism. Join us, the Reform. Let's forget about these antiquated issues of Shabbos and Kashrus and Binyan Beis HaMikdash and all these old ideas, and let's live a modern life. In fact, to this day, crazily, the Reform and conservative movements call themselves progressive Judaism. I always find that quite funny, right? As if Reform and conservative are progressive. They're not progressive, they're regressive. They're actually undermining Torah and mitzvahs. But it's as if you believe in progress, right? And in the 19th century, progress was associated with, as it is today, is associated with technological progress and innovative progress. And the Industrial Revolution was progress, and trains were progress. But here's the interesting thing. In the eyes of Reb Shlomo Kluger and the Divrei Chaim, progress and modernization were a dirty word. That's a dirty word. Don't talk to me about modernization. I've lost half of the young people of my community because of modernization. They've all become modernized and they're not Shomer Shabbos anymore. They've become modernized and they're going to college, they've converted to Christianity. So modernization is, for the Divrei Chaim and the Chedushei Harim, modernization was the enemy. Modernization was the curse of the 19th century. And what happened was, and here's the interesting thing, whenever you have ideological or cultural battles like this, certain small details become symbolic of that battle. And in the 19th century, the machine matzah, the innocent square machine matzah, became a symbol of modernization of Judaism, that the heilige matzahs, which Klal Yisrael have eaten for 3,000 years, were all round and handmade. And suddenly, guess what? We're modernized. We've got new technology. So the attitude of the Divrei Chaim was, don't you, the modern Jews, tell us, the Shomer Mitzvahs, how to fulfill our mitzvahs. We've been having hand-round matzahs for 3,000 years. We're not going to listen to you. And in the same way as the Hasidim rejected modern ways of dressing, modern ways of naming, modern ways of living in so many ways, machine matzahs were one of the rejected parts of modernity. To this day, incidentally, there are large communities in the Hasidic world who would be horror-struck at the idea of having machine square matzahs at the Seder table. Isn't that right? Anyone got any experience with that?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It's really true. There are many Hasidic families where if you tell them I'm bringing some matzahs, right? They say, listen, we only have hand matzahs. 7 or 8 days of Pesach is exclusively hand matzahs, because machine matzahs are, guess what they are? They're chametz. How do I know that? 150 years ago, the Divrei Chaim said they were chametz. And his words are sacred and immutable. And this is part of a very, very fascinating battle that played itself out 150 years ago, which to this day is still alive and well in a certain way. Now, the truth is that in our generation, many of the great poskim took the view that machine matzahs are, in fact, in terms of chometz and matzah, much better, in the sense that easier to monitor, it's easier to standardize the amount of water and flour that comes together, the amount of time that it takes before the water and flour actually gets into the oven, the heat of the oven. Everything can be measured and regulated with great precision in machine. I've been a couple of times with one of my rebbes, Rabbi Shua Neuwirth, the author of Shmir Shabbos Kil Chasa, who gave me smicha at one point, and who I went with him a few times to Cohen Halperin factory here in Yerushalayim and to see what they're doing, right? And it was amazing to see how they were making the matzahs, and how like a bell goes off and there's frantic activity for a moment to get all the flour and water mixed up, and then the machine is pounding it away, and the clock is ticking, right? The clock is ticking, and the machine mixes the dough, flattens it out, chops it up on a conveyor belt into the oven, and when 18 minutes are up, that's it, the machine switches off. Everything is off. And then they spend the next 10, 15 minutes just cleaning it, and all the little bits that are left over, and all the little scraps and all the flour and everything is completely cleaned out with high pressure, air pressure, and other mechanisms. And then the whole process starts again. But it is a very, because it is easy to monitor and it is very precise, there are many poskim who prefer machine matzahs. Now, I know that Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, my Rebbe, on Pesach, he ate machine matzahs. What I don't know about, and I've got conflicting reports by various people, is whether he ate the machine matzahs for the first and last kazayas on Seder night. I'm not sure about that. Some people say he did, some people say he didn't, but one way or another, he certainly was of the view that it was mutter to use machine shmura matzahs throughout the Seder. That was perfectly acceptable, right? It could be, though, that he was machmir on this particular halachic point that I mentioned earlier about the level of kavona lishma that can be engendered by a machine. That is a very interesting question, which really, on which there are simply two different views, and it's difficult to prove conclusively one way or another. But what's interesting is, and this is often the case in the modern world as well, that the battle takes place, the battlefield is square matzahs or round matzahs, this production or that production, but behind the battle in the halachic world, there is a hashkafic battle. The hashkafic battle is, do we embrace modernity and use modern technology in the best way possible, while at the same time, of course, preserving all the details of halacha? Or do we say, let's build a wall? This was the view of the more Hasidic communities and Rosh Shlomo Kluger. We're going to build a wall, and we're going to say any innovation contained within them a shmek, a tiny sense of a little tiny sense of modernity. And modernity is the curse of the modern world, because it leads to assimilation and it leads to a complete apikoros. So you have here, what's interesting is a mixture of halachic and hashkafic themes playing out on the in the battlefield of round matzahs or square matzahs. So next time, ladies and gentlemen, you go to the supermarket and you're shopping for square matzahs or round matzahs, spare a thought for the battle that took place in the Ukraine 150 years ago over this particular topic, and people were killing each other over it. Well, not killing each other, that's not true. They weren't killing each other, but it certainly led, incidentally, to the practice in many communities that people didn't eat in other people's homes over Pesach. One of the issues was this issue, that there were people who were very good friends, maybe even family or family-in-law, where one only ate machine and one only ate hand matzahs, and therefore they couldn't eat in each other's homes at all over Pesach. So this became, unfortunately, a very divisive issue. Somebody asked me here, lishma is a halacha. The requirement of the matzah lishma is a halacha, but only for the matzah that you eat for the first and last kazayas on Leil Seder. That matzah Shulchan Aruch, Siman Tov Samach, Siman 460 in Orach Chaim, in Hilchos Pesach, deals with the requirement of Shemura matzahs made lishma, which comes from the pasuk of Shmartem as hamatzahs. That's why we call it Shemura matzahs, because of that pasuk. That the Shemura matzahs really are manufactured l'shem mitzvah. That is really the. So that is the drama which I wanted to share with you this morning, and the fascinating aspects, lots and lots of fascinating issues out of it. Once you get to the late 1800s, the early 1900s, you had, for example, a town called Dvinsk. Dvinsk was a Jewish center. I'm talking about the turn of the 20th century. And there were two big communities there. One was more of a Litvischer community led by Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, who was later on known as the Meshech Chachma or the Or Sameach. Those were his two great contributions to Torah, was the Or Sameach on the Rambam and the Meshech Chachma on Torah. And Rav Meir Simcha of Dvinsk was the Litvischer Rav. And the town is Dvinsk, D-V-I-N-S-K. In Dvinsk, there was this community of Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, and he said machine matzahs were terrific. But in his town, there was also someone who was called the Rogatchover God. And the Rogatchover God was the head of the Hasidic community. And he said, no, they're no good, right? So it was just an example I came across in the town Dvinsk, where this debate, even though it was 50 years after the original Moda'ah and Bittul Moda'ah, nevertheless, this debate was still alive and well. And you had two great halachic poskim who were at odds with each other over this issue. Remember that these Rabbanim who disagreed even vociferously on this subject were in the real world good friends with each other and cooperated on lots and lots of things and worked together and discussed together and danced at each other's weddings. I mean, you shouldn't think that the Rabbanim involved here were engaged in a battle with personal hostilities. This was nothing about personal hostilities. This was about what's the best way to fulfill the mitzvah of Pesach, mitzvah of Matzah on Pesach, and do we or do we not allow ourselves to be guided by modernity and modern inventions. On a similar note, I must tell you, I've had similar conversations with Rabbanim of our generation today on the subject, for example, of techeles, the discovery of the blue color techeles in the last century, which has become available, and it's a bit expensive, but it's available. And I use both on my talis cotton and on my talis gadol. I use techeles already for about 25 years because I was convinced that this techeles has a good chance. There's, I think, an 80% chance that it is the right color blue. And even if it isn't the right color blue, there's actually halachically no downside to wearing techeles because it's not worse than wearing white threads. And it could be much better. And apart from which, aesthetically, it looks fantastic. So it increases the hidur mitzvah of my talis enormously for me. And when I say Shema and I say tzitzis and I hold the techeles, it's wonderful. many of the Rabbanim who are against Techeles in our generation are saying similar things to those Rabbanim who were against machine matzos at the time. They're saying, we have worn these white tzitzis for 2,000 years. Are we going to allow modern scientists and modern innovations and modern technology to change the way we fulfill our mitzvahs? We fulfill our mitzvahs with tzitzis. I want to wear the same tzitzis as my grandfather and great-grandfather and all our generations have been wearing. And it sounds to my ears like the same argument as saying, I want to eat the same round matzahs that my Alter Zayda used to eat, and that's how he used to eat them. And new technology notwithstanding. But in a sense, this is a very strange argument, because my great-grandfather never made a decision should he or shouldn't he wear tcheles. He just never had access to it. There was no possibility. Had he seen it, I'm pretty sure he would have used it, right? And the same is true about machine matzahs. Earlier generations never rejected machine matzahs. They just never had it. So exactly what attitude does one take to this question of using modernity in order to redefine, mainly using a phone in order to chat with your daughter? Okay, so that's technology for practical purposes. But do we use new technological innovations to change the way we do mitzvahs? That's the question. And on that, the Rabbanim of the 19th century were divided, and that seems to remain a hashkafic issue in the minds of poskim even today, in issues such as Techeles. And I must be honest with you, even in some attitudes towards Medinat Yisrael. Medinat Yisrael was also seen by many poskim as the advent of modernity, which threatened Torah and mitzvahs. And therefore, it was to be negated. If you adopt a view that anything which has been promoted and developed and, so to speak, invented by modernity is an enemy of classical Torah and mitzvahs, then Medinat Yisrael also presses all the wrong buttons, right? And also, in addition to which, secular Zionism was also responsible for a lot of assimilation and people abandoning Torah and mitzvahs in lots of cities, in Krakow, in Odessa, and in St. Petersburg, all these places. There were large secular Zionist groups who really took young people away from life into a Chiloni life. That's a fact. That's simply a historical fact. But what happened was, therefore, Zionism became associated with modernity in a negative way. But it's interesting that in the Matzot debate, this was one of the most well-documented and most, if you like, practical areas in which this debate raged. And I must say, whenever I look at this, look at the sources again, in the Sheol Meshiv, and in Shlomo Kluger wrote magnificent Shilas and Chuvas, Ha'elef L'chosh Shlema. Ha'elef L'chosh Shlema, his Shilas and Chuvas. He also wrote a commentary in the Shulchan Aruch called the Chochmas Shlema. But then again, and Rabbi Yosef Shaul Nathan Zon also wrote a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch called Mogen Giborim. In fact, the Mishnah Brura very frequently quotes Rabbi Yosef Shaul Nathan Zon's Mogen Giborim in his commentary Mishnah Brura. So we're talking about people who were accepted as major halachic authorities, but they differed in their hashkafic attitude to what extent can we accept the innovations of modernity and integrate them into an uncompromised Orthodox Jewish life. And that is the story, ladies and gentlemen, of this morning: round matzahs or square matzahs. That is the story. So enjoy your shopping. Share it when you're next in Rami Levi. You should stand up on a box and say, "Here they are, ladies and gentlemen: square matzahs and round matzahs." Let me tell you, these innocent-looking boxes actually represent a major division within rabbinic and halachic practice for the last 150 years. And don't think that this decision is devorim shel ma b'kach. This is a casual decision. It's not. When you're making your decision around matzahs and square matzahs, you're making a halachic and hashkav. You're taking a position. So my advice is buy some of each. Buy some of each, and in that way we are in fact benefiting from all the modernity of the square matzahs. And incidentally, hygiene also came into this in a big way. If you look at the literature, and the hand matzahs were very difficult to maintain, to monitor levels of hygiene. If you have kids, coughing and sneezing and talking to each other and working all night long and sweating and everything, making this dough, as opposed to the clinical and way in which the machine worked and was protected, the people the hand the machine matzahs are very big on hygiene topics. Also became something to be considered. So it was a debate took place on many levels, but it's I hope you've enjoyed going through this little trip down memory lane. But it was I find it a very fascinating topic every year again, and something worth thinking about. It only remains for me to wish you all a very, very enjoyable and happy Pesach, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give us all the B'samachta b'chagecha, the simcha of Yom Tov. And Chazal say, Rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania says in Rosh Hashanah Daf Yud Aleph, B'Nisan nigalu, B'Nisan asidin ligon. That we were redeemed in Nisan, and in Nisan we will eventually be redeemed again. So Pesach contains with it the sheirish, the seed of all future redemptions. And Bez Hashem, we should see that in the coming year. We're now taking a break from our Tuesday morning shiurim for a couple of weeks. Ellie will send you out an email telling you exactly when we resume. We're taking a Pesach break. Enjoy your families. Enjoy your matzahs, hand matzahs and machine matzahs. Enjoy them. Enjoy Seder night. And have a wonderful Chag Sameach. All the very best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
תודה רבה.
Shalom.